Good morning, Vicki. Thank you so much for that introduction. And first, I just want to start off by thanking you so much for having me this morning. I just want to get us started. Everyone who's joining us, I want to make sure that you can hear me okay. And also just kind of get us started with some introductions. So if you are here with us in the room and you have access to your chat, let's go ahead and get started. If you could let me know in the chat where your library organization is located, and maybe let me know your current role in your library organization as well. Let's go ahead and get started that way. If you go ahead and type in the chat, let me know where your organization is located and your current role in your library organization as well. So you have a couple of attendees who are grabbing the chat. Thank you so much. Excellent. So we have Tampa Hillsborough joining us, Manager of Collections. Excellent. Good morning, Jennifer from Wildwood Library and Administrative Services Manager. Hi, Amy. And Amy's with Umatilla Public Library. That's our library director. Hi, good morning, Angie. Angie's in Vero Beach, Florida, reference librarian. Okay, excellent. And as Angie noted, notes here too, I do a bit of everything. Thanks to those of you for typing in. I appreciate it. I think it's a great way for us to get started, get to know each other this morning. Hi, Gloria. And Gloria's with the Hernando County Public Library System in Brooksville, Florida. Currently a cataloger here. Excellent. And looking at collection development additions as well. And hi, Amy. Amy's joining us from Live Oak Public Services Manager. Well, if you are just tuning in, please feel free at any point to indicate your information in the chat. That would be great. I'm Erin Gray. I'm a library services and technology trainer from Amigos Library Services. And just really quickly to get us started this morning, I'll tell you just a little bit more about my background. I came to Amigos from about 16 years in public library service, everything from youth services, teen services, reference, collection development, and also a lot of branch management experience as well. And one of the favorite areas of librarianship for me has always been, patron requests and patron-driven acquisition. And so we're going to cover kind of a broad overview today of everything with patron acquisition, which is also sometimes referred to as demand-driven acquisition as well. Well, something that I always encourage, please feel free at any point in time during our session today to, if you have a question, please feel free to type that into the chat at any point in time. I'm happy to have us stop and take a look at things. Also, if there's anything in what we cover today that makes you think of a resource or a link that you want to share with our group, please feel free to do that too. I always welcome those shares. But just kind of quickly for our schedule today. So just a reminder that you'll be able to go back and access this recording if needed. So if you are working in one of our many busy library facilities in your area, you have to step away from the desk, you'll be able to come back to those resources. We're going to kind of start with an overview of, the role of patron requests, exactly, how we define those in public libraries, academic libraries, and even special libraries. And then we're going to look at different ways that we want to think about how do we grow our patron-driven or demand-driven acquisitions. How do we start new ones and grow existing ones? And then we'll also take a look at the importance of things like usage statistics and really looking closely at changes in our patron behaviors that help us understand more deeply the types of acquisitions that they're really looking for our collections. So we will kind of work our way through our first hour today, but we'll have the opportunity to take a 5-minute break about halfway through. So just know that I have that built in here. But please feel free to pop any questions in the chat as we go. Welcome those at any time. So I always like to start with a working definition of, what exactly is patron-driven acquisition? So just in general, any patron-driven acquisition is just whatever strategy, whatever process that your library uses, and this is going to vary for every single library, but it's whatever process you have in place to identify those materials that your patrons really want. Identify the highest priority items that your patrons want you to add to your collection. And for patron-driven acquisition, this can be everything from your print resources to your electronic resources. So this is everything from ebooks you might have in your collection to print books. It can be research articles that your patrons are requesting. So everything's included in here. Now, just to kind of cover everything for what we're talking about for this class, other similar terms for patron-driven acquisition are demand-driven acquisition. Sometimes they're referred to as patron selection programs, user-driven collection. You may even see them referred to as research-driven acquisition models or patron-initiated purchase. So there are a lot of different terms used for patron-driven acquisition. But at the heart of each of those designations is simply, it's just the approach that your library organization is taking for collection development of both print and electronic materials. So, library users find and identify the books and journal articles, before the library purchases them sometimes. So many times our patrons are kind of out there doing their own sort of searching, right? They're finding those titles to books that they want, or if it's a patron who's doing some research, they may find some authors or articles that they will make specific requests for because they've already kind of done that searching. They know what they're looking for. And so we're going to look at the ways that libraries kind of meet that expectation that our patrons have to fulfill those requests. So as we get started here, I do want to offer that I have a lot of different questions that I'm going to ask throughout our session today. Please feel free to type in your response in the chat, but it's also okay. Many of the questions I ask are kind of broader questions about your specific library organization, and they're also meant to just get you thinking about how your library organization currently kind of strategizes around patron requests and what your processes are. So it's just designed to kind of get us thinking about it. So as we get started today, the first thing I want to ask is, I want us to think about, for your library organization, it's going to be different for all of us. Where is your busiest front door right now? So what I mean by this question is, when you think about your library organization today, is your virtual front door, meaning say your website or your online catalog, is it your virtual front door, or is it actually your physical front doors to your library, bricks and mortar facilities that are the busiest? It's really important that libraries kind of begin by asking this question. So I'm going to pause for just a moment, and as you're looking at this, please feel free to type in the chat. If you kind of have a thought about this, if you're thinking, yes, I know immediately the traffic through our facility doors is greater than our, maybe our website portal resources. And I see, so Amy has our physical door. So please feel free to type in the chat if there's one quick answer that you're thinking. And if you're not sure, that's okay too. So we're going to talk about the different ways that our patrons are approaching both our physical front doors and our virtual or website ones. Um, and I see Amy Osborne has physical. Okay, so physical front door. So please feel free to type in the chat if you're kind of leaning one way or the other. And also, again, if you're not sure, that's okay too. One of the reasons I wanted to start with this was because at the start of the pandemic, the global pandemic, we found so many library organizations that were kind of in a pivot area, right? Where maybe they were experiencing much greater traffic through their online resources and their online catalog, maybe than they had ever experienced before. Some of those libraries have kind of returned to maybe a balance of similar traffic patterns on their websites and their library facilities, but we certainly have lots of library districts throughout the nation that continue to kind of see a back and forth on this. So some of them still are seeing the greater numbers for the electronic sites as well. So some of the things that we want to think about besides considering, what's our biggest front door? Is that our physical collection, or is it our online, collection? Are the majority of my patrons, requesting the materials and seeking resources primarily through my online site, or are those greater physical visits? We want to think about those things. And then the other thing we want to kind of consider, just as a broad kind of idea, is we want to think about, at the end of the day, what do our users want from our library? What are their expectations for what we offer in our collections? Maybe what are their expectations for the new items that we'll have in our collection on an ongoing basis? We want to kind of think about that. And in terms of this question, this is just a general, kind of putting us in that mindset of patron-driven acquisition. PDA, or patron-driven acquisition, at the heart of it is really about that focus on your library users and what they really want. What does the library look like through their eyes? And what does that process for them of requesting material or expectations for materials look like? And then on the flip side of that, it's also really important to think about what does your staff want from your library? And for some of our library organizations, there'll be some similarities between what your patrons are looking for in your collection and their expectations for materials available to them. But then there also may be some things that your staff would like to see from your library in terms of resources that you offer, especially resources that patrons are requesting. And so we kind of want to think about what are some of those similarities and differences. And we're going to dig deeper with this. So we'll kind of come back to both of these kind of broad questions, kind of look at how we can make sure that any patron-driven acquisition is really reflective not only of what our patrons are looking for, but also some things that our staff may be seeing as well. So I always like to kind of anchor this class on thinking about what it means to me, right, within a library organization to have a good library collection. Certainly we're all aiming for, each of these things here, right? We want to make sure that whatever kind of library we have. So if I'm at a law library or a medical library, maybe I'm at a large public library institution, no matter what, these are all the same, right? We want to make sure that the things that we're purchasing are, effective for maybe the research needs, but possibly also the, entertainment needs and informational needs of our patrons. We want to make sure that what we are purchasing is appropriate for our library organization. So does it fit in our collection goals and objectives? Does it fit with our library mission? We want to think about thinking about our collection in terms of accessibility, right? And we'll kind of dig in with that a little bit in terms of formats and also different ways that you make the materials more accessible. A good library collection, of course, for all of us is one that's responsive. And so by responsive, we mean making sure that we have processes in place to respond to the changing needs of our library patrons. For some of us, our higher kind of focus for our collection, maybe scholarly resources, and that's going to depend on your library institution. We all want to make sure that we have, good up-to-date resources for our library patrons. Some of our library organizations may have specific scholarly research areas, and that may be a driver for, building a strong library collection. And then also on here, for many of our library organizations, it can be really important as a mark of a good library collection that we have those popular materials that our patrons are really looking for. And so every library organization is working through all of these areas to make sure that they're kind of meeting them all. And one of the sometimes challenging things about responding to patron demand for materials is trying to create a balance between all of these things. So one of the things that comes into play whenever we're building focusing on building an even better library collection is, just the reality for some of our library organizations. We may be in a position where perhaps we have budgets that are shrinking, right? We might have some changes to budgets available to us for print resources and electronic resources. Certainly at all of our library organizations, staff time is limited, right? So that's kind of across the board for most library organizations I hear from, that there are always, changes in staffing, there's a change in focus sometimes. And so whenever we think about strengthening our library collections, we have to think about the staff time involved in as well. We have seen prior to even 2020, and certainly up to now in the new year in 2023, we continue to see this increased need for electronic resource. And that's an area which makes it even more challenging for those of us who are responding to things like patron requests, right? Circulation in some of our library organizations may be decreasing. Now, for those of you attending today, for some of you, this may be the case, but there are other library organizations who are, kind of in a less pandemic environment, who may be reporting that their circulation is actually maybe returned to prior levels or even increasing. So this is going to vary for all of us. And then also on this list, we're going to dig into this a little bit in terms of patron-driven acquisition, kind of tackling that, looking at what about those materials that we purchase through our library budget that never get checked out, and how do we continue to strengthen our processes so that we try our best to decrease the overall number of items that just never check out on our shelf. So I'm going to pause here for just a moment. And so for everyone kind of looking at this list, let me know in the chat if your library is experiencing any of these things on this list here. So let me know if there are any of these that you're looking at thinking, yes, this is something we're definitely, kind of working through. Okay, thanks, Amy. Amy has yes. And please feel free to let me know in the chat if there's a specific one that you're looking at that's something that you're working through for your organization, or if like Amy responded here, if it's just yes, all of these things. Jennifer has definitely balancing need and requests for electronic versus physical copies. Absolutely. Gloria has, I've seen where numerous titles are purchased based on outside popularity but are not in demand here. Thanks, Gloria. Yeah, and that one specifically, right? So kind of thinking about, are the things that we're purchasing, are they really those things that your specific patron population is interested in accessing? Jane has, again here, yeah, that increased need for electronic resources, trying to balance that with the need for print. Amy Stoltz has, budget is flat, right? It will be reduced for collections next year. Amy, thanks for that note. So Amy's letting us know, hey, most of my patrons do not use electronic resources as much as I would have thought. So and your circulation is slowly upticking for adult books, but not juvenile teen. And of course, Jane has items that don't check out, yeah, especially in nonfiction collection. I will say thank you everyone for all of these. I appreciate your chiming in. I think it'll help all of us kind of see what are some of the challenges that we're facing, because all of these are relative to those patron requests that we're receiving. And Sarah has, we have items that don't check out, electronic do not check out, right? So we're facing that. Maybe that expectation that our users have for both the print and electronic resources, all kinds. But then sometimes there's the issue of, we buy them, they don't check out. We want to think about how to tackle that. So thank you for all of that. I think overall, most of our library organizations of every type and size are really focused on looking at, new ways of building their collection, right? Maybe for some of us, maybe in the past, let's say, maybe some past decades, maybe we had some specific collection development plans that maybe had included some very, hard numbers for, say, our reference collection or different parts of our print nonfiction collection, things like that. But as libraries of today are now meeting greater demand for things like not only keeping those print collections, but also having greater electronic resources, we're really kind of having to think differently about how we want to build, that collection. So in terms of patron-driven acquisition, I've worked with a couple library organizations who have created new patron-driven programs, and then others who have, made some big changes to their patron-driven acquisition. And some of the things that they've always worked through in kind of approaching that is, if I increase my patron-driven acquisition, so if I increase the amount of materials that I purchase for the library, based on a specific patron request, right? Will that create more gaps in my collection? Things they may ask are, will we buy enough copies? A really valid question, especially from the staffing side, is, do we have time for, a new patron driven acquisition, or increasing that? What kind of staff do I have for addressing those? Really great question for all of our libraries. We cannot give them everything, right? Sometimes we don't have the budget to do all of that. Another question may be, and I will say, as a, having worked in collection development in public libraries, sometimes when you get patron requests in, you're going to be thinking, do we really need this for our collection? Is this, item our patrons requesting, is it something that's going to be, going to check out? And then another area that, some of us may run into is, you may be thinking, but we don't buy, X, Y, or Z. Maybe I have patrons that are now asking for things that traditionally my library hasn't, purchased in, large amounts in the past. So for some of us, there are things to think about with patron driven acquisition. And then what about those times when you find that we kind of reverse patron-driven acquisition? So I wanted to kind of give you a couple examples here. So when we're thinking about the way that we acquire things for our collection, sometimes it's through a patron request, but then other times it may be through a gift or donation, right? Sometimes we have donors for our library organization who may indicate a specific area of our print or electronic collection that they want to, help strengthen. And so sometimes that may dictate where we spend those monies. This is just a screenshot example from Ohio State University libraries. I kind of wanted to give you a different look at patron-driven acquisition. So Ohio State received a $50,000 donation for their rare manuscripts for the university libraries. And one thing that Ohio State did with that donation is they actually worked directly with students in those programs to decide what to add to that collection. So sometimes it may be that you have patrons making specific requests for maybe one or two items, but it may be that you're also in a situation where you're working with a donation or otherwise, and you have the opportunity to work directly with patrons for identifying what to add to that collection. So there are different ways of looking at patron-driven acquisition. Overall, I think one of the biggest questions that libraries will continue to ask when deciding how much patron demand or patron requests they can meet, they always ask, is this something that's going to work for our library district? At the end of the day, most of our organizations just have to try it, really. In terms of increasing our patron-driven acquisitions, we have to kind of put a process in place and try it, see what works for our patrons, kind of make some changes as we kind of go along. And so what does that look like when we are thinking about implementing patron-driven acquisition for our library district? Some of the things we may be asking are, do we need this? One of the library organizations that I've worked with in the past, we really spent a good amount of time thinking about how we were currently offering, patron requests and maybe some changes that we could make to it. But when deciding things like maybe increasing the number of requests that we would let our patrons have each month, one of our concerns, of course, was, will we get the things that we need? Will this fit within the budget that we have? How much patron-driven acquisition do we want to add to our processes? How do we deliver that to our patrons? So that may be kind of thinking about how you currently take patron requests and what kind of changes you want to make. How quickly are you able to add those materials to the collection? For those of us, and I would say specifically, especially those of us who are working directly in technical services and collection development, of course, one of our big questions is, what's our workflow plan? So if I am seeking to add more opportunities for patrons in my community to make direct requests for materials each month, I want to think about how that's going to increase the ordering workflow for my staff. I want to think about how that it could increase the time it takes to get materials processed and out to my patrons. I want to make sure that I think about that as a part of my process. And then also, how will this affect my budget? And then how will we evaluate the patron-driven acquisition? And then what's our plan for engaging our stakeholders? How do we let people know about this opportunity? So some things I will say from lessons learned in collection development from my own experience, I have found, even though there are many times when patrons may request electronic or print materials directly from the library. Let's say there are things that we can't get through interlibrary loan, maybe that we're going to purchase for the collection. I found that more often than not, those things that our patrons are requesting directly, they do tend to have a greater, chance of checking out than maybe we would have guessed in the past. It's amazing how our patrons really do have the ability to, kind of hone in and request these things that maybe we just overlooked or just hadn't added as a part of our collection purchasing. But maybe our patrons have identified, and they tend to be things that really will check out for the rest of our audience. But that being said, we want to think about making sure that whether our librarians are selecting the materials or our patrons are selecting them or asking for them directly, we want to make sure that we're looking at how we evaluate both of those. So I'm going to ask here as we jump into looking at patron-driven acquisition, and let me know in the chat, again, only if you feel comfortable, with sharing the information. Let me know if you have patron requests activated in your library organization, and do you have a specific number per month of items that your patrons can request? And feel free to let me know in the chat if you have that in place. Kind of pause here for a second. So please feel free to in the chat if you know or if you want to share that. I worked with, as you're kind of taking a moment here to type in, please feel free to let me know if you don't have a set amount in place that your patrons can request per month. That's okay too. Please feel free to let me know in the chat. So an organization that I've worked with in the past, one of the things that we were really working on was we wanted to increase the number of requests that our patrons could make per month. But before we did that, we really wanted to do some studying on exactly how many requests we were getting per month, the types of requests, and then really tracking if the things that were currently being purchased, if they were checking out or being accessed. Okay, Jennifer's got, we don't have a limit to the number of items patrons request, each item reviewed individually. Excellent. Thanks, Jennifer. I'm looking through here. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And how do you deal with those, right? Those physical, book donations too, right? Because those, for the patron may have an expectation, right, that those are going to be part of the collection too. Jane has, we buy most items unless it's specific or small press, hard to get. Okay, absolutely. And sometimes they pass it to ILL. And I would say in my background in public libraries, it's probably similar to Jane's response. Most of the time we could purchase the items, but sometimes it may have been something that was maybe really kind of out of our collection parameters, but maybe we had a community partner that already had that type of resource to offer. Amy Stoltz has, we have more requests than can fill, and they do it through a system or in person, budget of 5%. Okay, not a quantity. Yeah, absolutely. So for every one of us, Amy Stoltz, thanks for mentioning that. So really important when we're thinking about whether we already have some patron, patron requests or patron demand acquisitions processes in place. We really want to be aware of, what have we budgeted per year for that? What percent of our budget are we, prepared to support with? Claria has, we do have purchase suggestions. As far as you know, no limit on number of requests. Okay, thanks, Claria. Let's see. And then, okay, yeah, and of course, hopefully we're all, really reviewing those, making sure that they still fit in our collection parameters. And of course, that's going to be different for every one of our organizations. Oh, thanks, Amy, quantity for that, for the budget. Sarah has, we do have a suggest for purchase. We do have limits. Yeah, and to Sarah Williams' note here too, in my specific community, we found that we have a very eager population of patrons who love to do patron requests. And we have found over time that as we continue to add to the number of items they can request per month, they will keep requesting those numbers. So if the number is, 3 items per month today, and we change it to 5 items, our patrons will quickly eat up those, 5 items per month. So just as, let me go back up here. I think it was to Amy Stoltz's note, just like Amy Stoltz mentioned, we get, more requests than we can often meet. Jane has for the patron side, they request in a form and we buy ILL without the patron needing to differ between 2 options. Yep, absolutely. So I just kind of wanted to pause here and thank you everyone for kind of chiming in here, because I want to iterate here that, the process that you put in place is the process that works best for your specific library community. And so there's no, with patron driven acquisition, there's no right or wrong way to set these parameters. But hopefully as we go over our material today, it's a chance to just think about what we currently have in place and how well it's working for us. Are there some changes that we would maybe like to make or think about? So hopefully for all of us, as we kind of, whether we are kind of launching, say, a new patron-driven acquisition model, or even if we're maybe making some changes to our current one, we want to really think about the launch of that. We want to think about, how are we rolling that out to our users? Making sure that if we're going to make a big change to our patron-driven acquisition, right? Maybe I'm changing the number of items that a patron requests, or maybe I'm making some, budgetary changes to those allowance. We want to make sure that we're letting all our stakeholders know about those changes and what the rollout is going to be. So for instance, I had mentioned with a past library organization, before we decided to increase the number of print patron requests per month, we really wanted to make sure that we did a study of the current number of requests that we got, and make sure that we could identify out of those requests, what's the percentage of those that we're able to fill? How does it fit within the current budget we have for PDA? And if we're making changes to it, how could that affect our workflow, right? For our collection staff or our technical services staff, what are those changes going to be? And then also any changes that we make to launching our, PDA or changing it, we want to make sure that all of our staff members involved in that process are aware of how we do that, how we process those requests. We want to make sure that's involved so that our patrons really know what kind of the process is when they're making those requests. Of course, one of the biggest ways that libraries can really identify maybe changes that they're seeing in patron requests or even, patron behaviors in terms of accessing resources is by paying attention to our usage reports. I jokingly have always said that I'm kind of a nerd for data. I like all the data that I can get. We've been hearing from a lot of library districts, in the last probably year or so, right, as they're kind of maybe opening up their buildings and collections, and maybe even back to more, say, face-to-face programming, things like that. Increased outreach where they maybe had paused it for a little bit. We're seeing more library districts kind of take a closer look at, usage. How are things changing, right? What are some changes that we're seeing in maybe some use of our electronic materials? Are we continuing to see an uptick in all our, electronic materials? So if I have electronic books, ebooks that our patrons are checking out, am I continuing to see an overall increase in that, or is it kind of staying about the same, or is it going down? Things like that. And then also with our print collections as well, where are we seeing changes in usage? And so not just usage of things that our professional library staff add to the collection, but also things that are patron requests. We really want to take a really close look. This can be really eye-opening and can help us really kind of think about where we want to make changes in patron-driven acquisition. One of the things that really helped one of my library organizations in the past was we kind of had a period of time where we very closely tracked every single patron request that we were able to fulfill. So anytime we fulfilled a direct patron request for material, and we were successful, say, in ordering that material and getting it to them, what we did is for a period of time we closely tracked if that item checked out, if it's checked out by other patrons, things like that, to really kind of get a snapshot of what was tracking, what wasn't. Maybe were there specific topical areas in our collection, say our nonfiction collections, where maybe in some topical areas we noticed that those things that patrons directly requested were checked out by a variety of patrons afterward. But then in other nonfiction topical areas, we may notice that, it's really just that one patron who accessed that material. And then after that, it kind of, sat on the shelf. These are things we really want to be aware of. And then another thing we all want to take a close look at in terms of just a broad thinking about patron, requests, we want to think about, how does my collection development policy currently, support those patron requests? I always like to go back and look at, what does my collection development policy say? How is it either, supportive of those patron requests, or conversely, also making sure to look at my collection development policy to see if there are any barriers right there for patrons requesting items. The reason I mention this is sometimes it might be for library staff members, we may be aware of the ability that patrons have to make these requests, right? So for my regional public library district, I'm aware as a library information professional that patrons can, go onto an online form and actually request, a number of specific titles each month. But I don't want to assume that my patrons know this information. And so we also want to think about our collection development policy, and if this is something we're letting our patrons know about. And then also, as we are including these things in our collection development policy, are we making sure that it's accessible to all of our patrons, and how we approach that? Ultimately, patron-driven acquisition is really about prioritizing our end user. So when we're talking about patron-driven acquisition, we really kind of have to have a lens on, what does the library collection look like from, this patron? And I always like to imagine it just like this picture, right? There's either the virtual entrance or the actual physical entrance to the library, right? And I've got these patrons who are all kind of, maybe in line, looking to access print or electronic materials. And I want to think about what that looks like to them. How easy is it for them to access those materials or request them? How long does it take to get the materials? Things like that. Ultimately, whether the materials we select are selected by our collection development staff, right? Or they're materials that are requested specifically from our patrons. They're all about kind of our end user. I have found over time that patron-driven acquisition sometimes looks really different from our librarian, right? Through our librarian's eyes than our patrons' eyes, right? So sometimes our patrons, they may have the expectation that if your library can fulfill a request that they're making, let's say it's for a print book, their excitement and expectation might be that you can get that new print material to them, in a very short amount of time. And that might be really different from the actual process for your library organization, right? It might take longer to get the material or process it. So we want to think about things like that. If it's an article that the patron is requesting, right? So maybe we're doing maybe we're purchasing those, on demand for a patron, maybe research articles. We also want to think about how we're delivering that to the patron and how long do they have access to it, things like that. So in terms of thinking about our end user, I like to think about it like this. So when we're thinking about patron-driven acquisition, we also want to think about how our end user finds, materials that they want to request. How do they, are they kind of navigating our resources in a more, chronological versus topical manner? Sorry, there, had to cough for just a second. We want to think about, there's, searching through our library resources. Are they using mostly just open searching methods, right? Maybe they're just, using a keyword or, an author name, part of a title, or are they also activating, multiple layers of, filtering, right? So they may be adding, specific, criteria to their searches. Knowing some of these things can really help us with patron-driven acquisition as well. The reason I mention this is because sometimes when we're looking at the types of requests that we get through patrons, one thing that I found from collection development is if I'm finding that a lot of requests are coming through are for materials that are already in my library collection, one of the things I might want to think about as an information professional is, why was it that my patron, couldn't find this resource in our collection? What were the barriers in place that made that so? We want to think about that too. So as we're thinking about adding things to our collection for our patrons, anytime we get requests for items that are, readily available in our library collection, we also want to consider, are there kind of searching mechanisms or, barriers in place that maybe we need to think about in making it easier for patrons to find items. Another thing, and feel free to let me know in the chat if maybe you feel this is your library. Sometimes for our end user, This is really true. Sometimes too many options can be a barrier for them to find materials. And sometimes that's maybe how their request came through to us. So, for example, if I am your library patron and I'm doing some research, and I might be overwhelmed, right, by the maybe all the databases that your library offers. It may be that you have the electronic article that I'm looking for on, say, two or three of the databases that you offer. But as an end user, because of the way that I'm navigating your library site or conducting my searching, there may be too many options, and so that may be why I'm not finding the material. So as we think about adding things to our collection, we also want to think about, are there things that I can improve in terms of searchability of my library website and my catalog to make it easier for patrons to find these items? The reason we want to tackle this is because even though it may be that I'm responding back to the patron saying, hey, we already have this in our collection, here's the link to it, or here I already put you on hold for it. At the end of the day, I've still then used staff time to, respond to that patron for an item that we already have our collection. And so I want to make sure I find ways of not having that duplicate again and again. And then also for our patrons, what are the ways that they may be trying to reproduce those preferred results in our catalog? How can we make that easier for them? So patrons are always looking for ways to search again, right, for those favorite materials that they want. And it's helpful to know, how they're doing that. And so on this slide, I'm going to ask just in the chat, please feel free to let me know. Are there any things that you're thinking about in terms of your library website or even your catalog for the end user that, that you're working towards improving or thinking about, kind of changing to help them be able to find these resources rather than, submitting them as a patron request if you already have them? Are there things that you're thinking about that you want to make it easier for your patrons? For some of us, it may be employing more opportunities for them to tag items or share items. I'll pause here for just a second in case anyone has anything to kind of type in. Okay, don't see anyone typing, so I'll move forward. But anyway, we'll kind of come back to this one a little bit. If you think of something, please feel free to type it in the chat. But I did want to offer here that we want to make sure that as we're looking at how we fulfill patron requests, if we're continually seeing things that come through that are resources and items that we already have in our collection, we do want to kind of try to think about, what are the reasons maybe that patron, couldn't find that item or that resource? Are there some things that we could do on the cataloging side that can increase visibility for those patrons? So just kind of briefly, I just want to touch on, we want to make sure that as we think about patron driven acquisition, the focus is always on, the end user and their specific needs. And also, I think at its core, one of the greatest reasons for really strengthening patron-driven acquisition and being aware of what our patrons are requesting is that we want to make sure that we are increasing the diversity of our collection always, right? I really feel that patron requests really are a great opportunity to expose gaps that we may have in our collection. We want to make sure that our collection is reflective of all our community users, and having patron suggestion processes in place, patron driven acquisitions in place can really help increase our opportunity for fulfilling those needs and making sure that our collection is reflective of everybody. I've got oh, thanks. Gloria's got the one thing I don't care for with our system is that if you misspell a word, the system will not put forward a, do you mean? Yes, absolutely. And so hopefully everybody's looking at Gloria's note here. Yes, thank you for that. So this is an example of, thanks, Gloria. That's a fantastic example, kind of what I was mentioning from our last slide. So if you're seeing patron requests come through or repeated patron requests come through for, whether it's ebook or print book, could be research articles. As Gloria mentioned, we want to think of, what are the obstacles that are in place in my library catalog or on my library site that's making it difficult for my patrons to get to these items? What can I do about that? But that's a great example of, this is something that can really make it difficult for that patron to find that information. Another example I'll offer here is, sometimes you'll go to a library site where they may have a really fantastic collection of, say, library research databases, but maybe the way that they're presented visually to the end user can actually be a hindrance to them finding what they need. Yeah, I agree, Angie. It is really frustrating. It's also important that as library information professionals, we really try hard to think about what that catalog or that library site looks like from our patrons' eyes, because things that maybe seem like they're easy, from our perspective to find, may look completely different for our user. Amy has our system is the same. It's beyond frustrating. We use Amazon to find the book title and info, and then look it up in Koha. Yeah, much bigger problem to tackle. Isn't just up to me. Absolutely. I think for sure on these notes that you're making, this is where when you have that really great, reference staff intervention coming in, I always like to use it as an education tool as well. So if I happen to be face to face with a patron and we're working on things, if I have, tips or tricks that I use to find things more quickly and easily in my library catalog, I'm going to make sure to share that with my library patron. Now, it's true, at the end of the day, I may not be able to quickly and easily make changes to my ILS or integrated library system, like, Koha or, Triple I or, Evergreen or, whatever I use. But if there are some strategies that I use, I want to make sure that I share that with my user as well. But certainly there's lots of challenges that we face with our catalogs and our processes as well that can be a barrier. Okay, thank you for this. I think this is really good. Some notes. So we want to keep thinking about, from our patron side, what do these things look like? How how are the things that we can do to mitigate these frustrations that our patrons have for looking for things. And so just kind of on our current slide, and we're actually going to take a break here in just a moment. But again, I kind of want to get back to just the importance of why we have, patron suggestion or patron, demand acquisitions in place. Overall, we just want to make sure that we've got an eye on increasing the diversity of our collection. I'll share just before we go to break, I'll share just kind of a quick, story lesson learned that I've had as a library information professional. when I worked in collection development for a large public library organization, I always made sure to spend a little bit of time every single working week at a reference desk at a large, library facility. And one of the reasons why this was really important to me was because I wanted to make sure that I maintained the perspective of the library patron and not just the perspective my collection development hat. Because I always found that no matter how many, say, usage reports I had or um, kind of tools, maybe from some different vendors that we use, things like that for, building our collections. At the end of the day, I always found that there wasn't ever a replacement for actually having those conversations with my library patrons, whether it was face to face, over the phone, or even through, chat reference. I was always happy, but also amazed by, sometimes even gaps that I would find in our collection, maybe that I just wasn't aware of, and that probably I wouldn't be aware of if we didn't have these patron requests opportunities in place. So, for instance, maybe there's a certain area of nonfiction in our, collections that I was working on, maybe had just done a lot of ordering in that area to kind of refresh that portion of the collection based on our usage reports. But then I would actually have, a conversation at the reference desk with the patron, and they're seeking maybe two or three specific titles in that nonfiction area. And I would find that even though we had ordered some, great materials for that area, of course, I have a patron standing in front of me who has some additional materials that we probably should have considered adding to that portion of our collection. So we just really want to think about making sure that we're balancing our collection plans and then any kind of vendor, tools that we use to add to our collection, but also making sure that we're cognizant of the actual, patron feedback that we're getting on a daily basis and how that can really drive our purchasing as well. Well, let's do this. We're going to go ahead and take a 5-minute break. And so let's come back at 11:09, and I'll go ahead and hit mute here, and we'll just go ahead and take a little 5-minute break. Everybody can just get some water or walk around, and we'll come back in just a few minutes. We'll take a 5-minute break. Okay, welcome back. I hope everybody had a good break, and we are going to jump right back in here. I want to start as we come back from break with just taking any questions that you have. So, just going to take just a moment here as I pull up this next slide that we'll work through. Let me know in the chat if you have any questions so far, anything that we can take a look at before we head into the rest of our material. Okay, I'm not seeing anything in the chat yet, but please feel free to let me know if you have any questions. Um, Happy to take those at as any time as we go through. Um, oh yeah, and Amy has a thanks Amy for noting this one. Yeah, patrons often want series, but we can't get all of it. I'm wondering if the old way of thinking we have to have all of the series is still valid. Oh, Amy, thank you for that one. And for the rest of you joining us, please feel free to let me know if this is something that you're working through with your organization too. Um, Amy, I can say for the public library district that I worked for with collection development, we did not have the budget to support um, having a full run of every series that our patrons wanted to access at all of our branches. We just did not have the budget to do that. Uh, our organization uh, had what was called centralized floating collections. So, what we tried to do was to maintain, a full series run if we could uh, in our library district, but we were not able to maintain those at every single branch. That was just not something from a budget standpoint we were able to do. And also, when it comes to series two, some of us who really fulfill these, kind of in-depth patron requests for series books, there can be times where you may have portions of your, especially a print series that's uh, popular, but maybe it's been around for a long time. There may be times through your vendors that you order from where you're just not able to get, a new copy of certain, numbers in the series. So that can be a challenge as well. I think to Amy's note here too, I think thank you for that. It leads perfectly to this next slide. It's really helpful to, when you think about your patron driven acquisitions that you have for your library organization, making sure that you develop, what you consider to be a need from the patron side, defining kind of the scope of that. And what I mean by scope is, making sure in your library organization that you've defined, hey, here are the things that fit into, our collection parameters. But here are some examples of, maybe patron requests that are outside of those parameters that we just can't fill. They don't fulfill, our, collection development goals and objectives. And then also thinking about building options. So many of us are working with budgets where, we may not have the budget to support, every single one of those requests that we get in multiple formats, right? We may be able to support that request as a print format request or maybe for ebook, but maybe we don't have the budget to support both of them. We want to think about which options we're going to make our priority. And then also that we're actively evaluating it. So one thing I really encourage is if you have any sort of patron request process currently in place, making sure that you're building in the ability to evaluate how those are going. Things like knowing exactly how much you spent out of your budget that, each year for those patron requests. And then also kind of being able to pull out the data for, how much of that was spent on electronic resources versus print resources. And that'll really help you notice any kind of changes in patron, behavior in terms of requests and things. And then also I mentioned here adjusting or phasing out your PDA. It's of course PDA short for, patron driven acquisition. Some of us may find that we have facets of our PDA that just, don't work for us anymore, right? Maybe we've made a shift, maybe because of our budget that we have, maybe we've had to make a shift in the number of requests that we'll take, or maybe we're having staffing issues that make it so that those requests take a little bit longer to be fulfilled, right? So maybe those print books take longer to fulfill. We may want to make sure that that's part of something that we communicate to our patrons too. And of course, at the end of the day, it's all about, finding the right fit. So many of our library organizations work with, maybe several different vendors to get the resources that we need. It can be really helpful to make sure that we're having these conversations with our vendors about our patron request process too. So some of us may find that, it may be helpful if we're seeing an uptick in requests for certain types of items, letting our vendor know that, maybe finding ways that we can kind of meet that demand before we get those requests in. And I'll kind of get into that, a little bit more. And certainly I do want to mention here, some of our library organizations have, multiple types of patron-driven acquisition, right? We might have kind of purchase on demand for research articles, versus, maybe a form that we have online for a print patron request. We may have more than one model in place. We also want to make sure that we're thinking about how we engage staff in our PDA. So what are our staff roles in patron-driven acquisition? I like to think that even though I worked as a collection development librarian, I feel very strongly that every single library employee who has direct contact with patrons is in the practice of helping to build the collection. So even though I might be the person whose primary role it is to find and select and order those materials, I also feel that there's no replacement for that frontline staff member who is talking with the patrons on a daily basis about the things that they're looking for or expectations for, that they have for what should be in our collection. So we want to think about how we incorporate staff with that, and also how we're communicating our PDA process. So for our existing library staff members, making sure they're fully aware of, if we have a PDA process, what does that look like from the staff side? So making sure my staff member understands, if a patron is asking for a specific, say, title, and they're helping that patron fill out the request form online for that, that the library add that to the collection. I want to make sure that that library employee understands what happens with that request specifically after it's submitted, and kind of what the turnaround is for that item. That can be really helpful. And then also, of course, documenting usage and user behaviors with the PDA. It's really important to have ongoing kind of dialogue with all your library staff members about, hey, how's this going? What are some strengths to this? Any changes that you're seeing? It may be as small as, I had times where library coworkers maybe have mentioned, some of our patrons are, maybe they're mentioning that there are so many, points of data that they have to fill in, on this patron request form. or maybe patrons, I've had coworkers say, oh, my patron said they didn't submit the request because they thought they had to have the ISBN because we had that, line on the form. And it may have been a line on the form for requests where we didn't require a response. But if we had that on the form, the patron may have been confused thinking, oh, I can't make the request for this item because I'm not sure of the ISBN. So just things like that, being aware of things like that. And then also, if we're going to make any changes to our patron-driven acquisition, making sure that we're letting staff members know about that. If we're making a change in our collection development and technical services processes that will affect how long it takes for materials to get out to our patrons when they requested it, we want to make sure that we're kind of communicating that as well. And then on the flip side, how do we communicate that with the public, right? So some of us may be thinking about, do I have anything in my collection development policy that lets my patrons know about, how we take patron requests or suggestions, things like that. Some libraries have chosen to, include some specific information for their users about how they do that. Just on your screen here, I just wanted to show an example. And of course, this is an academic library example, but this is from George Washington University in DC. And they actually have kind of a section on their library site within their collection development policies that explains how they conduct their demand-driven acquisitions. And that's for your library organization to decide how much or how little you want to include, but sometimes that can be helpful. So if you go back and look at your collection development policies that you have for your library patrons to see if you don't currently have anything in that information about patron requests or how your patrons can request materials, sometimes that can be helpful information to add. In their case, they're letting their student body on their campus know about different vendors that they work with, and also kind of on demand purchase for research articles, things like that. So another thing, and I was really glad, I know more than one of you already mentioned this. Another challenge with patron-driven acquisition, of course, especially this day and age, is that a lot of our patrons want all the formats, right? They want the print version, and they want the ebook version. And sometimes there is the expectation from our patrons that the library will be able to have both of these at the same time. And sometimes our library budget doesn't match up with that. So it's really important with patron-driven acquisition to, let me go scroll back up. I know one of you mentioned, okay, yeah, I think it was Amy Stoltz. Amy, thanks for mentioning this. You had mentioned that, for your library organization, you specifically budgeted, 5%, a year for these direct patron requests. For some of our organizations, it may also be helpful to indicate in that budget, how much of that goes for specific, how much of it is for print, how much of it is for, maybe ebook requests, things like that. That can be really helpful for us too. If we have streaming models for our library district, so let's say we have, I'm going to use an example, let's say you have Hoopla or something like that, you may want to make specific notes in your collection development budget about, how much you'll spend a year for specific requests, even in those, streaming platforms as well. That can certainly be a challenge. I think overall, in terms of all the formats for patrons, being open and honest with our patrons about our budgetary limitations can be helpful. I think it's certainly okay when we're working directly with patrons who, maybe have multiple requests for let's say ebooks, and maybe we can't always fulfill all those requests, just letting them know that we we'll continue to look at those requests and build upon that collection, but that we do have a certain budget per year for that. Other things to think about are, I think it's really helpful, and this is just my kind of personal um, experience in collection development. I have found it to be really helpful to be aware of what percentage of titles, are selected by library staff, are used, within, let's just say, a 3-year window. I think I like to do this for both patron requests and also materials that are specifically selected by library staff. I think it's a good idea to be aware of, what's getting checked out, turnover, things like that. That can help us kind of think about conversations we want to have about being aware of our patron needs. And then we want to think about things like patron behavior and browsing online versus browsing in person, because they are very different. Some of you have mentioned, it's really helpful, some barriers that you're aware of with browsing resources online with your collection. And then on the flip side, you may be aware of some specific barriers in your facilities that kind of keep patrons from finding those things that they need. So some of those might also be environmental factors. By environmental factors, I mean by that I mean patrons who may have a physical barrier to getting to some of your library facilities, right? To find those materials. Also, time constraints, things like delivery constraints, and then some other things that can be a barrier for our patrons for making their requests are just library terminology. Sometimes our library catalogs and our websites may be a little bit heavy sometimes on library speak or library terminology, and that may be confusing for patrons. So sometimes they may not be able to find the materials that interest them because they're not familiar with the terminology. I like to think of it, kind of goes back to the lesson for me of always remembering that I work with library research databases every day, but my patron that I'm working with, when I say database, they may not know what a library database contains, or what kind of resources it has. That may be really unfamiliar for them. Even saying things like ILL to a library patron, they may not know what ILL is, or what the process for an interlibrary land request or something like that. So just things to think about. These can affect our patron-driven acquisition as well. If we are making changes to our maybe request form or the process that we have for patrons, we want to make sure that we look for opportunities to kind of free our patrons from the heavy library terminology, and make sure that we're communicating in a way that's really accessible for them. And then just kind of quickly on this one, I'm just thinking about PDA versus selector concerns. I want to think about the differences maybe in requests that we get between things that are patron selected versus things that are librarian selected. And then for those of us who are on an academic library campus, we might want to think about the differences in maybe faculty selected or suggested materials versus student suggested materials. And then also sometimes for our patron-driven acquisition, sometimes it might be a little bit driven by grant-specific selection. So what I mean by this is maybe my library has received a grant for additional nonfiction materials, and that may be a driver for my processing a greater number of, say, patron requests for, adult nonfiction materials, something like that. So that can be a change area. And then also on here, I mentioned competitor awareness. I want to explain what I mean by that is when we're thinking about um, improving or changing our PDA process, we do always want to be aware of what our other, neighboring libraries or um, higher education campuses, what they have in their collections. That can kind of dictate some of the purchases that we make. So here, an example that I will give you is in my region, there used to be two, you know, publicly accessible medical libraries. So for a long time, um, many of our patron requests for, maybe medical books or things along that line, those are things that we probably historically would have sent a patron, kind of contacted the patron and let them know that those materials were already accessible through two neighboring medical libraries. Because in that case, we didn't want to, spend that, budget area for materials that we knew our patrons could access quickly and easily. Another thing to think about there is if your library is part of a lending consortia, if your patron is able to, get those items, sometimes even faster through, maybe a consortial partnership that you have, that may be a driver of decisions that you make about, those things. But again, we want to make sure that we kind of think about the core of those patron requests. So for instance, when we are kind of deciding whether we want to purchase something or not, we want to make sure that it's really in line with our budget that we can support it with, and also that it's something from a sustainability standpoint we want to add to our collection. And then what are our, patron-driven criteria? And so this is one where I'm gonna just ask in the chat, if you know of one of these and you want to, mention it in the chat, please feel free to. It's helpful with patron-driven acquisition to at least internally have some documentation of what's criteria that you expect for those patron requests. So does it have to be within a certain publication date? Is there a certain, price maximum that you're working with these requests? Are there certain formats that you don't take requests for? Are there space concerns, things like that? Let me know in the chat if you have any that just kind of come to mind. One thing that I'm thinking of for our kind of area public library is in terms of, publication date, depending on whether it was fiction or nonfiction, and depending on the nonfiction area, we had some specific kind of target areas for publication date. Amy's got, I don't have any hard rules, just case by case. Okay, yeah, and to Amy's out here. Most of my requests are for print fiction. And I would say too, in terms of the publication date criteria, that wasn't something that we had in a, public facing collection development policy, but it was something that internally with collection development, we tried to pay attention to, make sure that we were staying within a certain publication area on certain types of purchases. Gloria has, I think ours are largely considered for their relevance based on our collection policy. Yeah, absolutely. So just something to think about and be aware of. Does the item have to have, certain, peer reviewed, scholarly reviewed, materials? I know many years ago when I started in collection development, there used to be discussions in lots of library districts about, oh, do we buy these, self printed books. Sometimes we would get, requests for these, self-printed books that would be on Amazon. But interestingly, what we found out in our library district was that somehow if we ordered them, especially if they were for print fiction, other patrons would check them out. So that was something we learned. Also, in terms of nonfiction, it can be really, sorry, in terms of not nonfiction, patron notification, it can be really helpful to think about, what process do we have in place for notifying our patrons? How do we kind of proceed with that? What's our turnaround time for notifying patrons? So this is just a screenshot example. This is from Bethlehem Public Library, and they're part of the Upper Hudson Library System. But you'll see, for instance, remind patron, hey, if this item becomes available at one of these libraries within 60 days, shall we notify you? Things like that. You may have certain ways that you want to notify your patrons about their requests. Ultimately, patron requests are really about, it's just exciting for your library patrons. I never had a situation where a patron hasn't been thrilled that they asked for a specific item and then we're able to get that to the patron. That's always really exciting for the patrons. I think that's one of the best, most exciting parts about patron-driven acquisition. But we also want to think about, we have those great times where our patron is excited because we could fill the request, but we also want to think about, how do we tackle, letting our patrons know how we decide to approve a request. This is a little example I wanted to provide. It's from Kalamazoo Public Library. They include a little statement with their patron suggestions that just indicates, I like their statement because it's letting the patron know that, hey, thank you for this suggestion, kind of keeping them aware that, decisions are board approved by their material selection policy, and just letting them know that, they have a process for, deciding what to accept as patron requests. And that, letting them know that, depending on the title, the cost, the date of the material, that'll go into the consideration. Sometimes that can be helpful in adding to your patron suggestion policy as well. Really and truly, we do sometimes just have to say no to patron requests. Feel free to let me know in the chat if you're the person who has these, direct conversations with patrons. I've had many of them over many years. Ultimately, I really try as much as I can to, if I have to turn down a patron request, I try to really make sure that I'm directing that patron toward resources we do have that are, maybe closely fit the request that they've made, and also give them the opportunity to, keep requesting things in the future. But of course, sometimes we do just have to say no because we're not able to, fulfill everything. It's really important in all of these to kind of make sure that you're aware of who's using your PDA. So what I mean by this is, if you're able to, with the data that you get through your patron suggestions, it can be really helpful to kind of identify, how many requests we're getting for, say, adult materials or, teen materials, figuring out, what are the number of patrons who are making these requests, things like that can be helpful. Amy has, I try to be kind and help them as I can. Yeah, absolutely. And of course, yes, it's disappointing for the patron when you can't get the item. But I do think when they see that you kind of went the extra mile and tried to show them, hey, but here are the resources we do have. And I've even had cases where I may be turning down the request because in my city, we have several higher education campuses with some pretty phenomenal print reference collections. So sometimes I might be turning down the request because that entire, maybe, you know, resource that they're asking for is readily available at, a publicly accessible, higher education institution. So I think sometimes just letting our patrons know those things can be helpful. Um, and then, so, find out who's using your PDA. So before you make any changes to it, decreases or increases, say to patron suggestions, things like that, find out who's currently using it, how they're using it, see what kind of requests are coming in. Also, just I mentioned this one just briefly, hidden PDA service versus visible PDA. It's different for every library organization depending on your budget. Some of us may really kind of put a lot of effort into, letting patrons know in lots of different spaces, right? Our library facilities and our outreach conversations we have in our community that we have these programs in place. But other library organizations may take a softer approach where maybe they have the patron request process in place, but it's not necessarily something that they market. It just really depends on your organization. In terms of just the success of patron-driven acquisition, some of this can depend on, the scale that you're taking with it. So as I mentioned earlier, Amy mentioned, hey, we've tagged, 5% of, the budget for these direct patron requests. It's a good idea to have an idea to know, what the scale is going to be for accepting these. And kind of also just being aware that any, patron driven, acquisitions that you have will affect the availability of your titles. You're going to be working with things like price increases. So those of us who are working in collection development, maybe say for ebooks, any of us who work with purchasing ebooks, we know that the prices for ebooks really go up and down quite a bit. And then also the ability of offering our patrons, metered access to those materials versus one copy, one user for an ebook material is really going to vary a lot. So that will affect our patron-driven acquisition. And also just if you're in a situation where you're seeing maybe depletion of those PDA funds before the end of your fiscal year, that can really affect things as well. I certainly have been in that situation where maybe a month or two before the end of our library fiscal year, we might be kind of slowing down a little bit on processing patron requests because we're waiting for the fiscal year to turn over. Sometimes that can be a situation that can affect, the success of your PDA. And then also, if you have certain approval plans in place, those can affect it as well. And we also, again, just want to think about, librarian facilitated PDA versus vendor facilitated PDA. Some of us may have programs set up with our vendors where we may have that patron request kind of that gets initiated directly to the vendor. And so maybe a point of purchase, maybe my user has the ability to, request a certain article or book through the library catalog, and that's purchased right through the vendor when they make that request. We want to make sure that we look at how that process is working for us and things like that. There could be a lot of kind of ebb and flow to that. And then I did want to mention, because I think this is something we'll continue to see more focus on, just demand-driven acquisition versus, evidence-based acquisition. Some libraries are kind of moving a little bit more toward maybe having a purchasing model where the library for certain items just triggers a purchase of the item when the patron, immediately when the patron requests it, versus other libraries might still be doing that through, say, an online form where they will evaluate it later and kind of look through it. It just depends on what works best for organization. I Feel free to let me know in the chat if you have any of these for your library organization. Some of us do. Some libraries do still, rent, lease, or rent, lease, or have an option to buy items. So that may be how they're providing some items for their library users. That's something we want to think about with our PDA as well. If we do find that we're getting materials from a vendor and it's on short-term loan or standing order even, we want to make sure that we think about that in comparison to, patron requests. And then we also want to think about, in terms of our PDA model, is it, just in time versus just in case? How we're approaching, letting our patrons ask for materials and how we're processing them. If we're at an academic versus public library, we might have some very different ways of approaching our PDA or DDA. So it just really varies a lot. It can vary on our budget as well too. I wanted to show you, this is a very large higher ed, campus. This is an example, it's from Cornell, but they actually include a statement in their collection development policies about, how they maintain fiscally sustainable collections. I wanted to share this one because I think it's a kind of good example of, when you're having those conversations with your library board and various stakeholders. It can be helpful to be able to talk about, how you have these programs in place. And of course, they kind of address, how they negotiate even, database subscriptions and things like that for their users. And then also, in terms of PDA, we also sometimes, some of us might have to think about shared collections or consortial PDA. For those of you joining us, let me know in the chat if your library organization belongs to a consortia as well. I'll wait and see if anyone belongs to one. I mentioned this one because my regional public library district also belongs to a very large consortia. So sometimes we may not fill certain patron requests because we can get the item pretty fast and easy through a consortia partnership. Okay, yeah, thanks, Gloria. Gloria has yes. So for some of us, that may be the deciding factor. And that may be something that we can communicate with our patrons too when they're making those patron requests. Sometimes if I had a patron who was frequently making requests for materials, and they were always those materials that were readily available in the consortia catalog that was linked on our library site, sometimes I might reach out to that patron and just make sure to give them that information to make it easier for them. Yeah, Amy has too. We're a member of a county cooperative. So for some of us, there may be a little bit of making sure that we're educating our patrons on that consortial opportunity to borrow materials too. That can help cut down on some of those patron requests that we get to. I really truly sometimes had regular patrons I worked with at neighborhood library branches who, once we kind of together looked at the consortia catalog that they had access to, they would say, oh my goodness, I had no idea that I could borrow all these other books. They just didn't realize that they could click on that link and then also access this whole, consortial catalog of items too. The other thing too, and I'm really happy some of you mentioned right early on, is kind of paying attention to those interlibrary loan requests. I always like to say, what do patron requests or ILL requests reveal about collection needs? Sometimes just kind of if you're also in the process of fulfilling those patron requests, I think it can also be helpful to have access to the ILL requests for your library district and kind of notice some similarities and differences that can help you with your program too. I think it is important to mention that with PDA models, one size doesn't fit all. So the patron-driven acquisition model that works for my organization, for our budget and our user base may be one that doesn't fit yours at all. So it's important to work with what works best with your patrons. And then in terms of PDA prompts, how do your patrons find out about, making those patron suggestions? If you work with faculty or staff, how are they aware of being able to be a part of that process and how do they make those requests? If you're on an academic library campus, you might have an additional process in place for instructors and faculty to request materials, and you might have a different priority process for those materials as well. And then also for your patrons, balancing their ILL requests and use versus the, just patron requests. And things to think about like holds queue, and then of course also ebooks. I'm going to mention this really fast, but again, we want to make sure that our patrons are aware of all the types of things that can be requested. I know I had many years working with patrons face to face at the library reference desk where sometimes they had patrons who thought that they could only request print materials through patron suggestions. They didn't know that they could request ebooks as well. So that may be something that your patrons aren't aware of, and we just want to make sure that they can't be aware of. And then also, are you seeing more patron requests for first time purchase of items, so items that are not in your collection at all? Or are you noticing more of a trend for just the patrons requesting the item because they want more of that item in the collection, right? Maybe the whole list is too long and they want you to get more copies of it, kind of paying attention to that. I mentioned like demand resistance here. On this, I just mean, what I mean is sometimes you may find that there may be a resistance sometimes when as library professionals, maybe sometimes when we have those patron requests coming in, hopefully we're open to all the needs of our patrons and we're not being resistant to the things that they're requesting simply because maybe we don't feel like they fit into our topical or scholarly goals and objectives that we're trying to reach. It's really important to be kind of open to our patron requests because like I said earlier, there are so many times in collection development where maybe I fulfilled a patron request and I thought, oh, I don't really know if anyone else is going to check out that item, but maybe I fulfilled the request. And I was always thrilled later on to find out that I was wrong, right? I liked checking in on an item later and finding that actually that patron picked something that lots of other library patrons really wanted to access. And I just wasn't seeing that as a selector. So I think that's really important to, be aware of our potential, bias, and also be aware of there may be gaps in our collection that, we're just completely not aware of, and those patron requests can help us with that. We will encounter things like publisher restrictions with our PDA. That's a normal part of the process, right? Sometimes we put in that, we process that request for that patron, and then the publication is, delayed and it's not going to come out until, months later, things like that. We just want to be able to communicate that quickly with our patrons. And then also, of course, I mentioned making sure that any changes that we make in our PDA, that we really pay attention to workflows when we make those changes. Make sure that if we're making a change that's going to affect, the ordering and processing side for our staff, make sure that we're ready for that ahead of time. Being aware that our patrons have varied needs and interests, and understanding that ultimately PDA is about kind of opening ourselves up to those changes in user behavior and interests, and kind of helping us keep ahead of the curve with that. PDA helps us kind of remember that we may be really familiar with a specific library facility with that specific community served, but there will always be pockets within our collection that aren't, fulfilling the needs of our users. And so PDA can really, really help us with that, with identifying those areas. And then ultimately, I think just thinking about, are we feeling, confident in the current suggestion for purchase process that we have? Are there any changes that we want to make to the way that our patrons can request those materials? And what would those changes be? Things like that. That can help us a lot too. I always recommend when teaching collection development and reading things like that, especially in terms of policy, I always recommend making sure that you review and update all your library policies every 2 to 3 years. But I think the same goes for your suggestion for purchase. So if you have an online form or something that you use for patron suggestion for purchase, I think it's a really good idea at least every 2 to 3 years to kind of revisit that and make sure that it's really working well from the side of your patron, that it's really eliciting their feedback and suggestions, making sure that's coming through. And then paying attention to things like your requirements for patron suggestions. So what I mean by this is there certain information that you're requiring on those patron suggestions, such as, let's say I mentioned ISBN or title or patron, things like that, or title or author, things like that. Noticing those things and understanding that they'll affect whether that patron makes that suggestion. And then again, I'm really big fan of kind of documenting and tracking patron suggestions. So feel free to let me know in the chat if your library does that currently. I worked with an organization that fulfilled a lot of patron requests, but we weren't always diligent about documenting the exact number of requests we fulfilled and kind of where those went, whether they went to adult fiction or nonfiction or, children's materials. But we really found that digging deeper and kind of documenting and tracking these really helped us make decisions about how much, budget money we were going to put toward patron requests, things like that. And then also just being aware of things like your hold ratios in your library organization. I found with collection development that when I was really seeing continued patron suggestions for materials that we already had in the collection, especially popular ones with really high holds on them, what I found over time was that instead of constantly getting maybe patron suggestions for additional copies of these items, maybe it was an opportunity to reevaluate our hold ratios, that maybe we just needed to order additional copies each time. And then also along those lines, thinking about your hold time versus your wait time for patrons. And then also thinking about, is there a difference between your print patron suggestion process versus your ebook process? And do you need to have some different parameters in place for those? Patrons are really excited about patron requests. And so we want to make sure that it's as positive a process as possible for our patrons. Sometimes we can think about things like if we had a profile for our patron suggestions, what would that look like? I know one of you mentioned that you get more requests for, say, adult fiction than anything else for your patron requests. That's something that can help you think about the profile of your users requesting your items. And then ultimately, we want to make sure that we're making our, you know, PDA discoverable, right? So we want to make sure if we do have a patron suggestion process in place that we're making it discoverable for our patrons. I'm going to pop forward just a couple slides here because I know that Vicki gave you access to the slide PDF too, and I don't want to take us too far over time. But I'm just going to pop down here just a little bit, and we'll just kind of, jump forward just with a kind of a closing kind of note here. I think we'll continue to see as we go forward kind of an expectation and demand from libraries for our streaming services. One thing that we didn't touch on a lot today, we touched on a lot of print books and electronic books, but I think libraries in terms of patron suggestions and requests, we're going to kind of start to see even more requests that are linked to some of those streaming services that we have. And we'll want to think about how we're going to build that into our kind of PDA process and model too. Well, I want to thank you all so much for joining me today. And I just want to take any questions that you have. I hope this has given you the opportunity to kind of think about what you currently have in place for PDA and maybe some changes that you want to make or things that you want to think about as you go forward. But please feel free to type in the chat if you have any questions as we head out. My contact information is listed on here. So if there's anything after this class, any additional resources that you want or any questions that you have, please feel free to reach out to me.